Well, the head of the agency, that's Philippe Lazzarini, says the move is more collective punishment inflicted on the people of Gaza. In a statement, UNRWA mentioned the ruling by the International Court of Justice ordering Israel to take immediate action to make sure that Palestinians have their basic needs met. It warned that that is only possible if UNRWA, as the largest aid agency in Gaza, is allowed to do its work. Israel has said it wants to get rid of UNRWA from the Gaza Strip. The agency said it would be immensely irresponsible to sanction it for the alleged actions of a small number of its staff, especially at a time when so many people are displaced and are in desperate need of help. Let's take this on. I'm pleased to say we have Chris Gunness, who's a former UNRWA spokesman, who joins us on Skype from London. And Chris, before we get into this, briefly, I just want to try and understand how UNRWA funding works, because it is funded almost entirely by voluntary contributions from UN member countries. So when nations say they are temporarily pausing additional funding, what exactly does that mean? Additional to what? Does it mean that all funding is paused?
Well, it means that the humanitarian work, which is the work that's immediately been done in Gaza, as the Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini has made perfectly clear, is now under threat. UNRWA is saying that it has funding to deliver these life-saving services for just a matter of weeks, perhaps a month, after which the food distributions, the medical, the fuel, the water, all of the housing that UNRWA has been given to 1 million displaced people in its shelters across the Gaza Strip, all of that is under threat. But perhaps more important in terms of the funding, what we're actually seeing is a coordinated political attack on UNRWA. The Israelis have made clear, an Israeli former official has actually said that we being the Israelis, cannot win the war in Gaza unless UNRWA is disbanded. So, what clearer signal do you want? So the voluntary contributions, as you say, they have to be increased massively. My message to the Arab world is, particularly the Gulf, is where are you? Because they're making billions all the time, each day, on oil revenues. A tiny fraction of those oil revenues would see UNRWA's financial problems disappear overnight. And this unconscionable gap in funding, which has been inflicted by these Western governments, that would be filled very, very quickly. So, yes, the funding is desperate. Yes, humanitarian services are under threat. Some of the most desperate people in the Middle East are now facing starvation. They're facing famine, and the Arab states need to step up to the plate.
So tell us, Chris, if you would, what UNRWA funding actually does. What does it provide, and what would will the impact be of, within a month, as you say, those major funders withdrawing their contributions? What would the impact be? It's a matter of life and death, is it?
Yes, well, put simply, and very simply, there are two main funding streams in UNRWA. There are the core services, the core budget, and that goes mainly to a huge education department. UNRWA educates over 500,000 children across the Middle East: Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza. So there are 5 of those fields in Lebanon. So don't just think of UNRWA as being in Gaza. UNRWA is providing these life-saving and humanitarian human development services across the Middle East. But then there's the emergency budget. So, UNRWA is doing these core services, which in times of peace it can get on with, but then suddenly there's an emergency, like we've got today in Gaza. And UNRWA has basically to carry on trying to maintain these core services, which is a huge responsibility in and of itself, while suddenly having to deal with all these other problems. I say problems, I mean there's a genocide taking place in Gaza. So that's the real problem for UNRWA, that in times of peace its core services would be ticking over, although under real financial strain, but it keeps having to turn its hand to deal with these emergency situations, as we're now seeing in Gaza. And that's the real problem for the agency. But to make clear, this isn't a funding crisis. This is an existential crisis brought on by a coordinated political attack being driven by Israel. Make no mistake about that.
All right, I'll come on to that in a sec. But when you say it's not a funding crisis, so I'm a bit confused. Within a month, it won't be that serious.
Crisis, but fueled by political considerations.
Right. OK. So Israel, as you know, says that UNRWA perpetuates the refugee crisis, obstructs peace and serves as a civilian arm of Hamas. What do you say to that?
Or a state which is waging what the ICJ says is a suspected genocide, for that government, that state, to accuse UNRWA, a UN agency, of perpetuating the conflict seems somewhat problematic to accept. But let's be clear about this. That accusation is part of an Israeli dream that by getting rid of UNRWA, you will suddenly get rid of the 6 million Palestine refugees we serve. That is not true. What perpetuates this refugee problem is the lack of the parties, particularly Israeli obstructionism, to allow the Palestinians to have their own state. Because let's be clear, the Palestine refugee problem, UNRWA's mandated responsibilities towards these people, is grounded in that problem. That would go away if the refugees are granted all of their rights within the context of a two-state solution. All of those rights, including the right of return, all of those would be resolved if we could move towards a just and durable solution in the context. I don't know whether people want to say one state, two state, no states, take your pick, but it's got to be a durable solution. At that point, when the Israelis in particular, but also the Palestinians, get together and resolve the overall crisis, the Palestine refugee problem will be resolved in the context of that. That is when they will be given a just and durable solution. And at that point, UNRWA can pack up its bags and go. It is the lack of that solution that's perpetuating the crisis, not anything to do with UNRWA.
Chris, we'll leave it there. Thanks for that. Chris Gunness, a former UNRWA spokesman. Thank you.